Hi, and welcome to this week's Sabbath School study video entitled Jacob the Supplanter. Our memory text is found in Genesis chapter 27 and in verse 36. And Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing." And he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" We've been talking about Abraham for a while, and we even moved on to his son, Isaac, who married Rebekah. But now the story continues through their sons, Esau and Jacob, specifically about Jacob. As the title says, Jacob the Supplanter. And so we'll study a little bit about his life in this week's lesson, so I hope you have your Bibles ready, and let's study together. Now let's talk about Esau and Jacob. And it's quite interesting because Isaac, their father, Abraham had taught Isaac about the Lord, and most importantly, the impact that it's going to have, or particularly in their genealogy, their descendants, how the Messiah was going to come. And so Isaac, understanding this, he taught his 2 boys, Esau and Jacob, about this birthright, because one of them, through their lineage, the Messiah was going to come. Not only that, they were going to receive certain material things. They would probably possess the land that Isaac owns, going to pass it on to them. But what's interesting, he didn't share this knowledge to them to then ask the Lord, which of my boys is the most deserving of this birthright? He didn't. He ended up passing this on and decided on himself that the oldest was going to receive it. Period. No matter what anyone says, the oldest is going to receive this birthright. But this idea of birthright is not necessarily the oldest. There is nowhere in Scripture that says the oldest is supposed to receive this birthright. There is more an expectation that the oldest would receive it. The expectation that the oldest would be the one that would be that leader in this household in terms of spiritually speaking. But it doesn't necessarily mean it will be always in that situation. There are many examples that it was the oldest, but there's also examples that it wasn't. When it came to Adam and Eve, their oldest was Cain. He was not the one to receive of that birthright. Abel was. But we know that Cain killed his brother Abel. Seth ended up being born. He was the one that took place of his brother Abel. So he was the one that would receive it. When it came to Abraham, with Sarah, they only had Isaac. So Isaac was the one that would receive it. Here, Isaac had Esau and Jacob, and God had already foretold about these 2 brothers in their mother's womb. In Genesis chapter 25, we're going to read a couple of verses to see the type of personalities that the 2 brothers have, and how God already foretold who should receive that birthright, who's the one that was more deserving, because they would be the one that their heart was going to beat for that, in doing those religious things and being connected more with the Lord. And through their lineage, through their descendants, the Messiah was going to come. In chapter 25, in verse 22, it says, "But the children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If all is well, why am I like this?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Very key there, how the older will serve the younger. It was foretold to Rebekah when she inquired of God of what's going on in her womb. God let her know. She shared that with her husband, but his focus was the oldest supposed to receive the birthright, period, regardless of whatever Rebekah or God said. The only problem was that we can't just simply say Isaac was the only one at fault here. Rebekah decided to join with Jacob in figuring out a way themselves how to receive that birthright, instead of acquiring that of the Lord and asking the Lord for help. But what are their personalities? Well, we see that developed as the boys grew in verse 27 of chapter 25 of Genesis. It says, so the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And there was a time where Esau was busy working outside. Jacob was going to make food. Esau was tired and hungry, went in to eat. And Jacob took the opportunity to inquire, to receive the birthright from his brother. Verse 29, it says, now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I am about to die, so why is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now I do believe that Jacob would have given him food regardless. I mean, Esau kind of exaggerated. He was hungry, he was tired, and he was going to die if he didn't receive anything to eat. But Jacob took the opportunity to get this birthright from his brother. But it shows something interesting. Esau only cared about the here and now. He did not care about the future. Especially, he did not care about his birthright. Jacob, on the other hand, he did care about his future and did care about that birthright. And what he did now was in preparation for that future. And that is something that we need to be thinking of as well in our lives. Are we always thinking about today and now? And I want things now, and I expect things now, and ignoring the future we need to be preparing for? Because the Lord, yes, he wants us to enjoy the blessings that he gives us now and be thankful for them. But at the same time, there's a future that God has prepared for us. And are we planning and preparing for that future? Or are we just like Esau, thinking about the here and now? I hope that we're thinking more like Jacob and planning for our future. But we need to acquire the Lord to prepare us and help us so that we are in the right path for our future. As soon as Esau learned that Jacob had received his father's blessing, he understood that he had been deceived and supplanted by his brother. He wants to kill him. But Rebekah is worried and wants to prevent this crime that would be fatal for both sons. So with the support of Isaac, she urges Jacob to flee to her family. On his way to exile, Jacob encounters God in a dream at a place that he will call Bethel, the house of God, and there will make a vow. You can read that in Genesis chapter 27, the story of how they end up deceiving Isaac as well as Esau, so that Jacob can receive not only the birthright, but the blessing that will come from his father to inherit not just the land, but more importantly, that spiritual application, that how in his descendants the Messiah will come will arrive through his descendants. Let's go to Genesis chapter 28. We're going to read verses 10 to 22. Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 22. So Jacob is fleeing, getting away from his brother. His brother is on the hunt to kill him. As we know, Esau is a skillful hunter. So continue there in verse 10, Genesis chapter 28. It says, now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran. So he went to a certain place and stayed there all night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head. And he lay down in that place to sleep. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Let me pause for a second. So I know in many of you in your minds are already thinking about it. Yes, that ladder does represent Jesus Christ. He's that connection between us and heaven. But if we compare that to Genesis chapter 11, how people of the world ended up coming together to build a tower, which the top would reach to heaven, their purpose was for themselves to make a connection between earth and heaven. They were trying to do that. And here, Jacob receives this dream that this connection is already there, but it's done through Jesus Christ. We'll see that more fulfilled after Jesus dies on the cross. But already he's seen that God has a connection between earth and heaven, and that is through this ladder, which we know it represents Christ. We see angels ascending and descending. Quite a different intake upon this. And it really shows how when it comes to things of the world has their own way of trying to find solutions to things. But we got to realize God already has a plan. We just have to trust in the Lord and ask the Lord, Lord, what are we to do in this situation? Continue here in verse 13. It says, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land in which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. So God is making this incredible statement that he's the God of Abraham and Isaac, letting him know that the distinctiveness of religion and the spirituality that Abraham and Isaac have compared to the rest of the world. That's one way to identify what kind of religion you belong to, or who do you worship, by saying, I worship the God of Abraham and of Isaac. And God is already foretelling the blessing that Jacob will receive. He will receive the land in which he is laying on, but also the land in which his brother is back home. But it's interesting, in verse 16, it says that Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So he, in the rising early, in that stone that he had placed on for his head, he decided to set it up as a pillar, and he poured oil on top of it. And in verse 19 it says, and he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city had been Luz previously. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone shall have set as a pillar, which I set as a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. So already there's a practice of tithing, where God has given him a great a gift for him to enjoy and the blessing to have, but he's saying, I'm going to give you back 10%, a tenth of that, to show that, yes, Lord, this is a gift you've given me, but this is yours. I'm just giving a tenth to acknowledge that. So that idea already was being practiced way before there was even a nation of Israel. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 187, it says that our time, our talents, our property should be sacredly devoted to him who has given us these blessings in trust. Whenever a special deliverance is wrought in our behalf, or new and unexpected favors are granted us, we should acknowledge God's goodness, not only by expressing our gratitude in words, but like Jacob, by gifts and offerings to his cause. As we are continually receiving the blessings of God, so we are to be continually giving. And as it says in the verse, as we freely were given, we should freely give to others as well. The blessing God has given us is not just for ourselves to be enriched and to be thankful for those blessings, but it's also to bless others as well. And let's not forget that those blessings we receive, they came from the Lord. And it's wonderful to be able to acknowledge that gift that God has given us by giving back to him a tenth of that. Something for us to keep in mind as the Lord continues to pour upon us many blessings. We continue our story, and now about when Jacob ends up working for 14 years. I mean, he showed incredible work work ethics and was faithful and diligent in his work, for 14 years in order to be able to marry the one who he loved so much, which is Rachel. How faithful, how diligent are we in our work that God has given us? It's quite remarkable. You can read this story about how he worked for 14 years trying to get the opportunity to marry Rachel in Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 to 30. We're not able to read all this. I don't want to spend too much time upon it, but it's a very interesting story, and it's a lot of details there that we can learn a lot from that story that can apply for us, and even to help us better understand what is going on. But the first thing that Jacob sees when he arrives at this place of destination is a stone, which, we just spoke about a stone previous, about he used the stone to be able to place his head when he went to sleep, but he ended up using that stone to build a pillar for the Lord. Kind of like show that significance about God, that the stone signifying God's presence, which also it's a kind of reference of what will happen in the future when it comes to the sanctuary and how God would dwell among his people. So that stone kind of foretold what would happen in the future. But anyways, it's quite interesting. There's a stone there as well, and kind of referred you back to Bethel. So it is this stone that will afterwards give Jacob the opportunity to interact with Rachel. When Jacob hears from the standing shepherds that Rachel is coming with her sheep to water her flock, he urges the shepherds to roll away the stone. They refuse, which gives Jacob the opportunity to do it alone and introduce himself to Rachel. It's in Genesis 29, verse 11. Rachel responds by running to her family. This first contact between Jacob and Rachel was productive. It mentions in verse 18 that Jacob loved Rachel. So there, in their interaction, they were able to bond, you can say sparks fly, and they were able to have quite an interesting conversation there that led Jacob to say, this is the woman I want to marry. So much that for 7 years he worked for Laban, Rachel's father, in exchange for Rachel, to be able to marry Rachel. So these 7 years that he worked for Laban were for him just a few days, as is mentioned in Genesis 29, verse 20. However, after these 7 years, Jacob is deceived. On the night of the wedding, it is Leia, the oldest sister, and now Rachel, whom Jacob discovers in his bed. He's taken advantage of the confusion of the feast and of Jacob's intense emotion and vulnerability. Laban had managed to trick Jacob. Jacob uses the same word for deceive that Isaac had used to characterize Jacob's behavior towards his father and his brother. So what happened to Isaac and Esau, and how Jacob deceived them, now we're seeing a deception being done to him. It kind of reminds you of Exodus chapter 21, verse 24. It says, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which is the culprit to identify with his or her victim, and that the culprit faces what the victim did in a similar way is what Jacob had done to someone else had been done to him. So we're seeing this situation occur. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of situation is happening. But the question is, why did God allow it? God had tried to get through to Jacob and let him understand that what he did was not right. And if he couldn't get any other way to do it, he had to experience that to be able to understand what God was trying to say. So Jacob finally understands what it means to be the victim of deception. And ironically, God teaches Jacob about his own deception through Laban's deception. Although Jacob, as deceiver, knows well what deception means, he is surprised when he is the victim of deception. He asks the question, why have you deceived me? In verse 25, which shows that he knows deception is wrong. In Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 310, it says, deceit falsehood and unfaithfulness may be glossed over and hidden from the eyes of man, but not from the eyes of God. The angels of God who watch the development of character and weigh moral worth record in the books of heaven these minor transactions which reveal character. If a workman in the daily vocations of life is unfaithful and slights his work, the world will not judge incorrectly if they estimate his character in religion according to his own standard in business. In other words, there needs to be a proper reflection that if God is teaching us to be honest, to be faithful, we need to be doing that in our business, in our lives, not just in religious things, but in all aspects of our lives. We need to be reflective of God's way of doing things. Continue here, the last quote says that he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. It is not the magnitude of the matter that makes it fair or unfair. As a man deals with his fellow men, so will he deal with God. He that is unfaithful in the mammon of unrighteousness will never be entrusted with the true riches. The children of God should not fail to remember that in all their business transactions they are being proved, weighted in the balance of the sanctuary. And like I just touched upon, the purpose of this segment is to let us understand and realize that God doesn't just want us to be learning about how to do things properly just for the sake of doing things properly for the Lord, but he wants us to do that in every aspect of our lives. The world will not understand who God truly is on their own because they don't care about God. But through his people, the world will understand. But they will be confused if we do things their way, if we do things unfaithful, in deception and lies, instead of doing it the way God asks us to do so. It may not be fast. It may not be the most attractive way. It may not be something that the world may be inclined for, but is the way that God intends, and the world will understand and know who God truly is, and will have that choice to make in their life, to trust and follow the Lord or continue in their path to destruction. In Genesis chapter 29, beginning in verse 31, all the way to chapter 30, verse 22, it's quite an interesting story. It's pretty much the center of Jacob's story, and it begins and ends with the phrase that God opened her womb, first referring to Leia in verse 31, and then finishing off in Rachel in Genesis 30, verse 22. Each time the statement is followed by births, the evidence is that these births are the result of God's miraculous action. But in all this, there's this rivalry between the two wives of Jacob. Rachel is the one that Jacob loves the most. Leah feels sort of unloved, feels left out in a sense. But God blesses her with many children. She ends up having 6 boys for Jacob. And when you read those verses, Rachel is not able to give birth. And in between the births of Leah, Rachel ends up telling Jacob to have a child with her servant on behalf of Rachel. And then Leah did not like that, so she asked Jacob to have a child with her servant. So there's a lot of issues and problems going on here that are not right. But God uses somehow these things to be able to create a nation from the seed of Abraham. We're going to read a few of the verses just to have an idea of what's going on. In chapter 29, beginning in verse 31, it says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Reuben. For she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Then she conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simon. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. So we see the problem that Leah is having. Unfortunately, she ends up marrying a man that does not really love her. She ends up loving her sister more instead. But yet God is withholding Rachel from having children. There's quite interesting the names that are mentioned. For instance, Reuben, the first one, whose name means to see, because God saw that she was unloved by Jacob. This child was a compensation for her and her pain and suffering. In addition, she gives the name of Simon, the second child, second son, because he had heard the death and the humiliation of her pain, and thus had pity on her, just as he had heard Hagar's affliction as well. So we see how these names that she gives her son, it's a reflection of what she's going through, and God giving her these sons is kind of like he hears, he sees, he understands what's going on for her as well. But strangely, it is only when Leia cannot give birth again that God remembers Rachel and opens Rachel's womb. So let's go back to Genesis chapter, this time let's go to chapter 30. We'll start in verse 6 and we'll finish up to verse, verse 19. Genesis chapter 30 verse 19, and we'll read all the way to verse 22. It says, then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. So this is the last son that she ends up having. And it says in verse 20, and Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment, and my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter, and she called her name Dinah. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. So we see that the result of took some time before God then able to give Rachel a son, a child. Rachel is the beloved wife, had to wait 7 years after her marriage, and about 14 years after her betrothal with Jacob to have her first son. Compared with Leah, she didn't have to wait too long to be able to conceive. Rachel gave him the name of her son Joseph to signify that God had taken away her reproach, and she added to her another son. If you could continue to read in that chapter 30 of Genesis. So however wrong these situations were, God was still able to use them to create a nation from the seed of Abraham. In Patriots and Prophets, page 238, it says, inspiration faithfully records the faults of good men, those who were distinguished by the favor of God. Indeed, their faults are more fully presented than their virtues. This has been a subject of wonder to many, and has given the infidel occasion to scoff at the Bible. But it is one of the strongest evidences of the truth of Scripture that facts are not glozed over, nor the sins of its chief character suppressed. The minds of men are so subject to prejudice that it is not possible for human histories to be absolutely impartial. Had the Bible been written by uninspired persons, it would no doubt have presented the character of its honored men in a more flattering light. But as it is, we have a correct record of their experiences. Men whom God favored and to whom he entrusted great responsibilities were sometimes overcome by temptation and committed sin. Even as we are at the present day strive, waver, and frequently fall into error, their lives with all their faults and follies are open before us, both for our encouragement and our warning. If they had been represented as without fault, we with our sinful nature might despair at our own mistakes and failures. But seeing where others struggled through discouragement like our own, where they fell under temptations as we have done, and yet took heart again and conquered through the grace of God, we are encouraged in our striving after righteousness, as they, though sometimes beaten back, recovered their ground and were blessed of God, as we too may be overcomers in the strength of Jesus. On the other hand, the record of their lives may serve as a warning to us. It shows that God will by no means clear the guilty. He sees sin in his most favored ones, and he deals with it in them even more strictly than in those who have less light and responsibility. I know it was a long quote, but it had incredible truth there. God wants us to realize that God's people in the past also had the same faults and issues and mistakes that we have and we're facing now. But they continue to come to the Lord, and God continued to be with them and help them to overcome their shortcomings and their faults. The same for us. Regardless of our shortcomings, regardless of our faults, we have to still come to the Lord, and he will help us navigate these things in our lives, and we will reach the point where God wants us to reach and be a blessing for others, because others will see that, hey, yeah, we make mistakes, but we come to the Lord, and God helps us to learn from them, to overcome our problems, to continue to improve and develop God's righteousness in us. And that is truly a great witness that we can share to the world, so that others may know who God really is. Now, Jacob has been for 14 years away from his home, from his family, and now it's time for him to return. But what occurred? What are the events that led him to be able to finally say, okay, my time here is up, I must return back to my family? Well, let's continue reading Genesis chapter 30, verse 25 to 32. Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 to 32. And we continue off after his wives, Leia and Rachel, and as well as their servants. He ended up having many children. We continue here, but after Rachel has gave birth to her son Joseph. Verse 25, it says, "And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children to whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service which I have done for you.'" So he's letting Laban know, kind of letting him understand that, hey, I've done everything that we agreed upon. I've worked for you these 14 years. Let me go back to my home, to my family, with my wives, with my children. So Laban in verse 27 said to him, "Please stay if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake." So we see the example of Jacob, not necessarily the best example, but through that Laban was able to understand and know better who God is. Continue here in verse 28. It says, "And he said, 'Name me your wages and I will give it.' So Jacob said to him, 'You know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it was increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house?'" So he's kind of letting him know, he wants me to give him all this stuff back, but it's like, where am I going to provide for my own family? You want me to give you everything back that God has blessed us? Because Laban didn't have anything when Jacob first arrived. And it multiplied greatly once Jacob was there. And so he doesn't want to give everything. How he's going to provide for his family? He doesn't just have one wife. He has two wives, and you can say two concubines, and many children. He has about 11, 12 children now. So what ends up responding here? Verse 31, it says, "So he said, Laban said, 'What shall I give you?' And Jacob said, 'You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks.' Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So he's kind of like negotiating with Laban and understanding, okay, you don't have to give me anything, but maybe I'll select some of these here so I can provide for my family, and you can keep the rest for himself. In the lesson, it mentions here that God ends up revealing himself to Jacob as the God of Bethel in Genesis chapter 31 verse 13, and saying, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, go out of this land and return to the land of your family. So we see in the past, in the verses before, that Jacob understood his time there was up. He wanted to return. He tried to negotiate something with Laban to be able to take something with him to be able to take care of his family. But he also waited upon the Lord on when to leave. In verse 13 of chapter 31, God ends up telling him to arise out of this land and return to the land of your family. It's quite interesting because God had told Abraham to leave the land of his father and go to the land that God had prepared for him. This time is different. He's in a land, Jacob is in a land that is not of his father, in a land that God had not given to him, and he's asking him now to return to that same place where Abraham was sent to, you can say. So it's quite interesting, the language here that was used. So what helped Jacob see that it was time to go was the attitude of Laban's sons and Laban himself. In Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 and 2, it says, Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and for what was our father's, he has acquired all this wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. So because of his sons, Laban ended up realizing, I'm going to be left here with very little. He did not want that. And so this attitude that Laban ended up having, as well as his sons, he felt threatened. And he realized, time is up. I need to leave. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 193, mentioning about this incident, it says that Jacob would have left his crafty kinsman long before, but for the fear of encountering Esau. Now he felt that he was in danger from the sons of Laban, who, looking upon his wealth as their own, might endeavor to secure it by violence. So now he has a choice. He could have returned sooner, but he was afraid of his brother Esau. He stayed there for a while, but now he realized he needs to leave because he's in fear of the violence that might come from Laban's sons. And so he'd rather go back to his family and face his brother. So he took his family and possessions and left, beginning another phase in this saga of God's covenant people. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 192, it says, As time passed on, Laban became envious of the greater prosperity of Jacob, who increased exceedingly and had much cattle and maidservants and manservants and camels and asses. Laban's sons shared his father's jealousy, and their malicious speeches came to Jacob's ears. He had taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was of our father's had he gotten all this glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not towards him as before. So I want to read that part to realize, to help us understand really that the access that was seen in Laban in terms of wealth wasn't really his, it was Jacob. He had acquired that wealth. It was just mixed and mingled with Laban. It did bless him and did benefit Laban because his wealth also increased. But when Jacob said, I will like my stuff, my things, my wealth to be able to move on, they didn't want that to be gone. They wanted it for themselves. And so he realized time is up for me to move on. We need to be careful. There's a lot of lessons here we can learn. For one thing I will mention is who we go into business with. We need to be careful. God can bless us and can bless others as well, but we need to be careful that the blessing that God may provide for us, sometimes people get envious of that. And so we need to be careful. We need to trust upon God, Lord, and be guided by Him so that He can help us navigate tough situation and avoid any kind of violence and dangerous situation that may occur. God was able to help Jacob in this situation and help him leave this place before it got violent and protect him and his family and be able to make it to their journey back home. So it's a wonderful lessons that we can learn from Jacob's life that we can really apply in our lives as well. Lots of lessons that we can take from there. Something that I just wanted to bring to mind. For one thing, deception may be something attractive to use because we may get results quick and now. But we can't be like Esau. We gotta be like Jacob in the sense of we need to be looking for that future and planning for that future. And that future should be having eternity with our Lord. And so what we do now and today should be in preparation for that future we want with God in heaven and enjoying eternity with Him, and not be like Esau and thinking of the here and now, which we see now the world is thinking about that. They think this is it. This is the only planet that we have, and we need to find a way to save it and protect it. Save and protect it from what? We're the ones in danger because of sin. And only Christ can give us a solution to overcome sin and get rid of sin in our lives. And so we need to be preparing and planning for our future with God. And we need to be active in that preparation. To finish here in our lesson today, in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 366, it says, "Since the sin of our first parents, there had been no direct communication between God and man. The Father has given the world into the hands of Christ, that through His mediatorial work He may redeem men and vindicate the authority and holiness of the law of God. All the communion between heaven and the fallen race has been through Christ. It was the Son of God that gave to our first parents the promise of redemption. It was He who revealed Himself to the patriarchs. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses understood the gospel. They looked for salvation through man's substitute and surety. These holy men of old held communion with the Savior who was to come to our world in human flesh, and some of them talked with Christ and heavenly angels face to face." It happened to them, it can happen to us as well. Christ is still the main focal point for us to be able to communicate back to God the Father. He's still the answer and the one that can connect us and unite us with heaven, like that ladder that Jacob dreamed of, that angels were able to ascend and descend, made the connection, connected heaven and earth. Not man's way, they were trying to build a tower, but God's way. And the opportunity is there for all of us. Let's not lose that opportunity. Let's not push aside this amazing gift that God has given us, like Esau did with his birthright. Let's care for it. Let's desire it. Let's want it. Let's preserve it. And most importantly, let others know so that they too may prepare and have their lives submitted to the Lord and prepare for that amazing future that we can have with God. So I hope you had an interesting lesson with me. Thank you for joining me. I know it was quite long and interesting. Went all over the place, but I thank you for your patience, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, may God bless you, and Maranatha.